She looked like just another weary traveler, mud on her boots, a duffel slung over one shoulder, and eyes that had seen too much. When her card was declined at a roadside coffee shop, the single dad behind her stepped forward, without hesitation, paying for her drink with a quiet smile. He didn't know her name, he didn't know her past, and he certainly didn't know she once led missions no one dared speak of. What began as a small act of kindness would unravel a story of healing redemption and the quiet miracle of choosing to stay. If stories of unexpected connection and the power of second chances speak to your heart, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and let this unforgettable journey unfold. The wind howled low across the Pennsylvania Turnpike, sweeping dried leaves into whirling columns that danced along the cracked pavement of a half-forgotten roadside diner. It was the kind of place truckers loved and locals ignored, a faded sign flickering neon and coffee that tasted more like stubbornness than beans. Chris Avery pulled into the gravel lot just after 7 a.m., his old Chevy Silverado grumbling as if protesting the cold. He parked beneath a dying maple tree, reached for his coat, and glanced in the rearview mirror. His daughter Anna still asleep in the back seat, her small body wrapped in 2 layers of blankets, curled like a kitten. Chris smiled. She had his eyes and her mother's quiet strength, and a heart that didn't quite beat the way it was supposed to. This was their routine now. Early drives to the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, a quick breakfast stop, a few hours with doctors, who smiled too much, then back home before sunset if traffic was kind. It wasn't much of a life, but it was theirs. The bell above the diner door jingled as Chris stepped inside, the warmth and scent of burnt toast washing over him like an old flannel shirt. A few truckers nursed mugs at the counter. The waitress Marla, with her mile-high hair and attitude to match, gave him a nod. Usual Han, she called. Yeah. And a hot cocoa to go extra marshmallows. He was reaching into his wallet when the door opened again, letting in a gust of wind, and her. She didn't make a sound, just stepped inside like a shadow peeling off the morning. Tall, lean, with a military-cut jacket stained by road dust and something darker near the cuff. Her boots were scuffed, her jeans torn at the knee. A worn duffel bag hung from one shoulder. She kept her head down as she moved past the counter. "Restroom?" she asked, voice low and scratchy like gravel beneath tires. Marla pointed without looking up. The woman disappeared down the hallway. Chris returned to the counter, trying not to think too hard about her. There were plenty of veterans drifting through these towns, people trying to outrun something that couldn't be outpaced. 10 minutes passed. Chris sipped his coffee, eyes on the window. Then the woman emerged, and Chris noticed it. The faint red smear on the chrome handle of the bathroom door. Dry. Not fresh, but not old either. The woman walked up to the counter, dug into her jacket, and pulled out a debit card. Her hand shook barely, but Chris saw it. So did Marla. She rang up a black coffee and an egg sandwich. Declined. The woman didn't flinch. She tried again. Declined. She looked up. Cancel it. Chris stood before he could stop himself. Add it to mine, he said, sliding his card across the counter. The woman's eyes met his. There was nothing pitiful in them. No gratitude. Just surprise and something deeper. Wariness, maybe. Or weariness. The kind that went deeper than skin or bone. The kind carried in silence. You don't have to do that, she said. I know. She hesitated. I'll pay you back. You don't have to. She nodded, took the coffee and sandwich, and walked toward the door. Chris expected her to keep going, to vanish like she came. But she paused. Thank you, she said. Then added after a beat. Most people don't notice anymore. Chris didn't answer. He wasn't sure what she meant. Outside, the wind picked up again. Chris watched through the foggy glass as she climbed into an old green pickup across the lot. It looked like it hadn't passed inspection in a decade. The engine coughed to life, sputtered, then died. She tried again. Nothing. Chris sighed. 10 minutes later, as he tucked the Coco beside Anna and started the truck, he noticed her still sitting behind the wheel, forehead resting against the steering column. Not crying. Just still. That stillness haunted him all the way to the hospital. He didn't see her again for 3 days, and when he did, she was asleep in the cab of that same truck, parked half a block from his daughter's school, arms crossed over her chest, her breath fogging the cracked window. Chris didn't know her name. Not yet. But he knew the look in her eyes. And he knew somehow, in that strange way, intuition whispers to those who've lived with quiet pain, she wasn't just another lost soldier. She was something else entirely. The next time Chris saw her, it was early evening. Autumn had painted the trees in deep ambers and rust reds, and the sun was folding itself behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the sleepy town. He was driving Anna home from her after-school appointment when he noticed the same battered green pickup parked near the edge of Miller's Field, just a few blocks from his house. It was tilted slightly on a slope, the front tire nearly flat, and the cab windows were fogged over. Something about the image stirred him an instinct, a quiet pull he couldn't explain. As they passed, Anna leaned forward from the back seat. "Daddy is someone sleeping in that truck." Chris didn't answer right away. He told himself it wasn't his business. People came and went. They carried burdens he couldn't see. But something in that woman's eyes had settled under his skin like a splinter you don't notice until it aches. That night, after Anna fell asleep with her favorite book open on her chest, Chris walked down to the field with a thermos of hot tea and a flashlight. He approached the truck slowly, careful not to startle. Through the passenger window, he could see her slumped in the driver's seat, arms crossed, chin to chest. The duffel bag was still beside her. He tapped on the glass. She stirred, eyes snapping open with the reflex of someone who'd slept in too many unfamiliar places. "Didn't mean to scare you," Chris said, holding up the thermos like a peace offering. "Thought you might want something warm." She stared at him for a long second, the flashlight beam catching the edge of her cheekbone, the set of her jaw. Then she opened the door. "I wasn't asleep," she said. Chris didn't argue. He handed her the tea. "I didn't catch your name last time." "Grace," she said. Just that. No last name, no questions in return. "Chris," he replied. "And this probably sounds crazy, but if you need a place to stay just for a night, I've got a garage out back. Insulated. Warm. Not much, but better than this." She looked at him again, searching for something. Ulterior motives, but his face held none of that. Just a quiet sincerity. "I don't take handouts. It's not. Think of it as community kindness. You don't strike me as someone who asks for help easily." A long pause, then finally a slow nod. "I'll leave at first light," she said. Chris didn't push. He led her down the street, pointing out houses as they passed. Who lived where, who to avoid, if she hated small talk. When they reached his place, he guided her around to the detached garage, opened the side door, and flicked on a single hanging bulb. The space was clean, with a worn couch, an old electric heater, and a mini fridge humming softly in the corner. There were no decorations, just function. "It's not much, but it's safe, and you're welcome to use the shower inside if you need." Grace nodded again but said nothing. She set her bag down gently, as if it contained something fragile. "Can I ask one thing?" Chris said before leaving. She looked up. "Are you running from something?" A flicker crossed her face, so brief it might have been imagined. Then she turned away. "Not anymore," she said, quietly. Chris let that sit. He closed the door behind him, the night air brushing past his skin like a whisper. The next morning, Grace was gone. Chris expected as much. He checked the garage before waking Anna for school and found the couch empty, the tea thermos cleaned and left on the counter. But 3 nights later, she was back. He found her again sitting on the back steps of his porch, hands tucked into her jacket, staring at the stars like they were old friends. She didn't ask to come in. She didn't explain. Chris just opened the door and said, "The garage is unlocked." She nodded, stood and went inside. From then on, it became a rhythm. Grace never stayed 2 nights in a row, never took food, unless offered, never spoke of where she went or what she did when she was gone. But she returned sometimes for a night, sometimes for 2, and Chris found himself not minding. Anna asked once, "Is that your friend?" Chris paused. "I think so." Does she smile? Not often. Maybe she forgot how. Chris looked out the window where Grace sat in the yard, sharpening a pocket knife with methodical patience. Maybe he said, "But I think she remembers other things, like how to disappear, like how to carry pain without dropping it." And Chris suspected, like how to save lives. But for now, she slept in his garage, drank his tea, and said almost nothing at all. And somehow that was enough. The air shifted with the seasons. Leaves crunched underfoot. The sky settled into a soft grayness that seemed to mute the entire town, and early frost began to bite the windows each morning. Chris noticed these things more than usual. He always did, when something unfamiliar lingered at the edge of his routine. And Grace was becoming just that. A quiet presence woven into the spaces between his days. She never made herself known inside the house, never entered uninvited. But Chris would often find small signs of her presence. His shed reorganized the broken fence post in the backyard, quietly replaced the old rain gutter finally patched. She moved through his life like a wind that fixed things instead of scattering them. Anna grew used to her, as if Grace had always been there. She asked few questions, content with the little she knew. To her, Grace was the lady in the garage. And somehow, that was enough. One evening, as the fire crackled in the living room, and Chris worked on balancing the bills, Anna lay on the rug drawing. She looked up at him with the kind of curiosity only children have when the world feels safe enough to wonder. "Why doesn't she talk much?" Anna asked. Chris glanced up from the calculator. "Some people carry their stories inside. They don't always come out in words." "She's like a book with no title," Anna said. Chris smiled at that, soft but sad. "Yeah, but even untitled books have pages." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the window. Chris stood and looked out. Grace was sitting on the porch steps again, staring out at nothing, her hands still. She had a stillness to her that was unnerving, at first controlled, like she was always half prepared to vanish. He grabbed 2 mugs, one with coffee, one with cocoa, and stepped outside. "Cold night," he said, holding out the cocoa. She took it without a word. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that wasn't awkward, but rather earned. The silence of people who didn't need to fill space just to prove they were present. "I found a knife under the couch in the garage," Chris said eventually. Grace didn't turn. "It's not yours." "No, but neither is the space, and you still fixed the shelf in there. I was using it. Figured it should hold." Chris studied her profile in the moonlight. There was something elegant in her restraint. Not just quietness, but precision. Like every word she spoke had already been weighed. "Were you military?" The question hung between them, not sharp, not prying, just an offering. She didn't answer right away. Then, yes. "Army." She exhaled a sound that might have been a laugh if it had more air in it. Something like that. Chris didn't press. Grace sipped the cocoa and watched the tree line as if waiting for something to emerge. "You're not afraid of being here?" she asked finally. Chris looked at her. "Should I be?" "No," she said. "But I wouldn't have come back if I thought you were." They sat like that until the cold numbed their fingers and the stars blinked wide above them. A week passed. Grace came and went. Chris offered no explanations to neighbors, and no one asked. This was the kind of town where people preferred silence over confrontation, and where the only thing worse than being talked about was being noticed too much. Then came the day Anna insisted Grace join them for dinner. "She's always outside," Anna said. "That's not fair." "Maybe she likes spaghetti." Chris hesitated. "She might not." Daddy Anna said, "With the sternness only a child can manage, everybody needs to eat." That evening, Chris knocked gently on the garage door. "It's just dinner," he said when Grace opened it. Anna's request. She looked tired, more so than usual, but she nodded. Inside, she sat stiffly at the table, hands on her knees. Anna talked enough for all three of them about school, about Mrs. Dawson's cat that got stuck in a drainpipe, about the drawing she'd made of Grace, but with a sword like a knight. Chris watched Grace through it all. She smiled once, brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. After Anna went to bed, Chris poured 2 fingers of whiskey and handed her a glass. "You don't owe me anything," he said. Grace took it, looked down at the amber liquid. "You'd be surprised how many times I've heard that." She didn't elaborate. Instead, she said, "I used to think silence was safety. That if I said nothing remembered nothing, I could live without... Wait." Chris didn't reply. "But silence," she continued, "just makes the weight invisible. Doesn't make it any lighter." She drained the whiskey and stood. "I'll fix that squeaky step tomorrow," she said. And with that, she disappeared into the night. Chris sat alone a while longer, the echo of her words resting heavy in the quiet she left behind. And he realized something. She was still carrying whatever it was, but she had started putting it down one small piece at a time. And maybe she was beginning to remember how to live again. The town's fall festival was the kind of event that existed more out of tradition than excitement. Hay bales, cinnamon donuts, half-hearted carnival games, and neighbors pretending they hadn't seen each other at the grocery store 3 hours earlier. It was charming in the way only small-town events could be, with their handmade banners and plastic tablecloths fluttering in the breeze. Chris didn't usually attend, but this year, Anna begged. "They'll have the pony ride again," she pleaded, already pulling her coat on. And face-painting, Chris couldn't say no to that smile. He bundled her into the truck and found himself navigating the narrow rows of parked vehicles lining Main Street. They arrived just as the sun dipped behind the storefronts, casting long amber shadows across the booths. Grace was already there. He spotted her across the square, standing at the edge of the crowd, hands in her jacket pockets, her face partially hidden beneath a worn ball cap. She watched the people with the quiet focus of someone who had never quite belonged in a crowd. It surprised him seeing her there voluntarily, but then again, Grace was full of surprises. Anna waved when she saw her racing toward the cotton candy stand without waiting for permission. Grace turned her head, slightly catching Chris's eye. He made his way over. "You came," he said, handing her a small paper cup of cider. "You said it was tradition," she replied. "I figured I should try acting normal for once." Chris smiled. "You're doing great. You even blend." "That's the point," she said, not quite smiling back. "Sometimes blending in is the best way to survive." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching Anna dart between booths like a pinball. Then Grace tensed beside him. Chris followed her gaze. At first he didn't see it, just a man in a frayed army jacket stumbling out from behind a vendor tent, clearly drunk, shouting something about the cost of a hot dog. But Grace had already stepped forward, cutting across the lawn before Chris could stop her. "Hey," she called, her voice sharp and even. The man turned mid-rant, swinging his arm wildly and nearly knocking over a kid with a balloon. Grace was there in a blink, placing herself between him and the crowd. Her stance shifted, shoulders squared. Feet planted, her whole posture suddenly tighter contained. "Back off," the man growled, swaying. Grace didn't flinch. "You've had enough. Walk away. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." There was no yelling, no threats, just that voice, calm, commanding, and impossible to ignore. The man blinked at her, disoriented. Then, after a long pause, he muttered something under his breath and staggered toward the parking lot. Grace stood still for a moment, then turned back. Chris was watching. So were a dozen others. She caught his eye and quickly looked away. Back at the cider booth, Chris handed her the untouched drink again. "Refill," he said lightly. She didn't take it. Her jaw was tight. "I shouldn't have done that. You stopped a guy from knocking over a kid. I stepped into something that wasn't mine." Chris frowned. "You kept people safe." Grace exhaled, slow and controlled. "That's not what bothers me." He waited. "I didn't think," she said quietly. "My body just reacted." Chris was silent for a moment, then asked, "What did it feel like?" "Too easy," she said. "Too familiar." Later, as the sun dipped low and children were handed caramel apples and plastic trophies, Chris walked Grace back to the truck. Anna had fallen asleep on his shoulder, her face painted like a tiger mouth, slightly open. "You trained for that," Chris said, as they reached her side of the vehicle. Grace opened the door, paused, and looked at him. "I didn't train to stop drunks at harvest festivals," she said. "I trained to eliminate threats in hostile environments. What you saw back there, that wasn't kindness. That was control." Chris adjusted Anna's weight on his shoulder. "And sometimes, control is what keeps people safe." Grace looked down at her boots. "It's also what keeps people alone." He reached out, touching her arm gently. She didn't pull away. "You're not alone here." She didn't respond. But for the first time, she didn't retreat either. That night, long after Anna was tucked into bed and the cider was poured into mugs back home, Chris sat on the porch steps, nursing his drink and listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Grace joined him without a word, her movements quiet and deliberate. She sat with her elbows on her knees, gaze fixed on the darkened yard. "Do you think people can come back from the things they've done?" she asked softly. Chris turned toward her. "Depends on what you mean by come back. Live differently. Be someone new." He thought about it. "I think the past never leaves us, but I think healing isn't about pretending it didn't happen. It's about choosing what comes next." Grace nodded once, then looked down at her hands. "I used to think I was only valuable in chaos, that outside of the job I had no place." "You were wrong," Chris said gently. She didn't argue, and for the first time she stayed until the fire burned out. The first snow came early that year, just a light dusting, like powdered sugar sifted over rooftops and treetops. Chris watched it fall from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, the scent of cinnamon toast lingering in the air. Behind him, Anna sat at the table, swinging her legs, chattering about snow angels and whether Grace knew how to make them. "Do you think she ever made one?" she asked mid-chew. Chris smiled, pouring more coffee. "I think Grace has made all kinds of things no one knows about." He didn't know if it was true, but he hoped it was. A knock at the back door interrupted the morning quiet. Not loud, just a firm, intentional tap. Chris opened it to find Grace standing there, hair pulled back under her hood, her cheeks red from the cold. "There's a loose panel on the shed," she said. "I'll fix it before the wind gets worse." "You don't have to, I know." He stepped aside to let her in, but she didn't move. "I'm good out here." Chris handed her a travel mug of hot coffee. She took it without a word and turned back toward the yard. It was always like this. Grace offering help before he could ask, appearing with tools or small repairs, staying on the edges of his life like a caretaker who didn't want to be seen. but slowly those edges had begun to blur. Later that afternoon, Anna slipped on the icy back step. Chris heard the sharp cry and was out the door in seconds. But Grace was faster. She'd been working near the shed hammer in hand, and by the time Chris reached the porch, she was already there, kneeling beside Anna, cradling the child's wrist with practiced gentleness. Anna whimpered, blinking fast against the cold. "Let me see, sweetheart." Grace said her voice softer than Chris had ever heard it. He dropped to his knees beside them. "She's okay," Grace murmured. "Just a sprain, maybe a small twist. But we'll wrap it." Chris watched her move, efficient, calm, utterly sure. She pulled a small first aid kit from the back pocket of her jacket, like she always had one ready, and began bandaging Anna's wrist with gentle precision. "You've done this before," Chris said. Grace didn't look up. "More times than I can count." Anna sniffled. "Are you a doctor?" "No," Grace said. "But I've been in places where waiting for one wasn't an option." Chris didn't press, but the pieces began falling into place again, the way she moved, the way she assessed, how she never startled, and always noticed everything. Later, when Anna was resting with a heating pad and a book, Chris found Grace on the porch, sitting on the edge of the steps, elbows on her knees. He sat beside her without speaking. "I was deployed for 12 years, she said, finally voice low. Did 3 rotations in conflict zones. The last one was the kind of place where maps weren't real and orders were written in shadows." Chris remained silent, letting her fill the space how she needed. "My team was elite, classified. We didn't wear names. We didn't salute. We executed. Rescues? Recon. Sometimes things no one wanted to admit happened." She rubbed her hands together. "We went in for hostages. Children. It was supposed to be clean. It wasn't." Chris glanced sideways at her, but she kept her eyes ahead. 2 of my men died. One because I made the wrong call. The other because I didn't pull him in time." She swallowed. "After that, I couldn't go back. Not really. I walked off the base after my debrief and never went home." Chris spoke gently. "Isn't this home now?" Grace shook her head. "Home is a place where people would notice if you didn't come back." He paused. "Anna would." That made her look at him. "She talks about you like you're some kind of forest knight. Says you keep the house safe even when we're sleeping." Grace laughed, a quiet, broken sound that seemed to catch her off guard. "I've been called worse," she said. Chris leaned back on his palms, watching his breath curl into the air. "You know what I think?" he asked. "I think people like you were trained to survive everything but peace. And now that it's quiet, your instincts don't know what to do." She didn't reply, but she didn't deny it either. "You don't have to earn your right to be here," he added. Grace looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You're not afraid I'll bring trouble. I'm more afraid you'll keep carrying all that alone." She didn't answer, but she stayed there beside him until the sky turned navy and the porch light flicked on. And when she rose to leave, she turned back. "Thank you," she said. Not for the coffee, not for the porch, but for seeing her. Chris stood and watched her go, realizing something else entirely. Grace had learned to patch wounds she didn't feel, to save others while letting herself slowly bleed. But now she was learning how to stay. The storm rolled in without warning. 1 minute the sky was just a flat, dull gray. The next, it cracked open like a ruptured dam, unleashing a wall of sleet and wind that howled against the house like a wounded animal. Chris was in the kitchen when the power flickered. Once, twice, then died altogether. He set the flashlight on the counter, grabbing the old battery-powered lantern from the pantry. "Anna," he called. Her voice came from the living room, soft but shaking. "I'm cold, Daddy." He hurried to her side, pulling a blanket over her shoulders. Her cheeks were flushed and her breathing too shallow. "Your chest hurts?" he asked. She nodded. Chris didn't panic yet. Anna's condition had flared up before. But this was different. Her skin was clammy, and when he touched her forehead, heat radiated off her like a furnace. "Okay, kiddo, hang on. We'll get through this," he murmured, trying to mask the fear creeping into his voice. The cell phone had no signal, landline dead, too. Outside, the storm pounded harder, wind turning the snow horizontal. The roads would be impassable. He didn't have four-wheel drive and no chains on the tires. He moved on instinct, grabbing blankets, checking supplies, preparing the fireplace. But even as he worked, a quiet terror gnawed at him. What if she crashes tonight? What if I can't stabilize her? And then came the knock. It was sharp, precise, like someone who didn't want to be ignored but wasn't panicking either. Chris opened the back door to find Grace standing there in the snow, her hood half-frozen breath visible in bursts. "I saw the lights go out," she said. "Thought you might need help." Her eyes scanned him, quick, deliberate. She saw the panic behind his calm. Didn't wait for an explanation. "What's wrong?" Anna, Chris said. "She's burning up. Breathing's tight. I think it's her heart." Grace pushed past him, heading straight for the girl. She knelt beside the couch, peeled the blanket back, and pressed 2 fingers to Anna's pulse. How long's she been like this? 10, maybe 15 minutes. Grace looked up. "We don't have time." She moved quickly, speaking in clipped commands. "Boil water. Find clean cloths. Do you have electrolyte packets? No Gatorade apple juice." Chris scrambled, obeying without hesitation. When he returned, Grace had Anna propped on her side, speaking to her, in a voice he hadn't heard before. Low, rhythmic, full of confidence. Not comfort. Not tenderness. Command. "Good girl. You're doing great. Stay with me, Anna." She checked her vitals with clinical precision, using the beam from her pocket flashlight, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Chris stood, frozen Gatorade in hand. "You're not just trained," he whispered. "You're medical." Grace didn't look up. "I led field extractions in 0 light zones. I've treated men with bullets still in them while under fire. This..." She glanced at Anna. "I can do this." She ripped open a packet from her own duffel bag, one she'd brought in without asking, and began mixing what looked like powdered IV nutrients into the juice. "Help her sip this. Slow and steady." Chris took the cup, his hands trembling. What if it's more than a fever? Grace finally looked at him. "Then we ride it out. And pray." Hours passed in a blur. The storm outside intensified, but inside a strange calm took hold. Grace never stopped moving, sponging Anna's forehead, checking her breathing, whispering instructions. Chris stayed beside them, watching helplessly, as his daughter fought her body with every shallow breath. By midnight, the fever broke. Anna slept, her breathing rough but steady. Chris slumped against the wall, drained. Grace sat cross-legged near the fire, her eyes locked on the little girl, as if willing her to stay in this world. "You saved her?" Chris said, voice cracking. "No," Grace replied. "She saved herself. I just reminded her how." Chris studied her. The snowflakes melted into her jacket. Her face, exhausted, carried an expression he couldn't place. "You're not just trained," he said again. "You're elite. Special forces." She was quiet for a moment. Then slowly she reached into her jacket and pulled something from an inner pocket. A folded cloth. She opened it carefully. Inside was a tarnished badge. SEAL Commander, the trident insignia unmistakable. Chris exhaled. "Why didn't you say?" Grace shrugged. "People see that and expect something I'm not. Or they expect too much." He shook his head. "I've never expected anything from you." But that, he nodded at the badge, makes everything make sense. "No," she said. "It doesn't. Not really." She folded the cloth again tighter this time. I commanded men who died following my lead. I've done things in places that don't exist on maps. And when it was over, there was no parade. No homecoming. Just silence. Chris sat beside her. I know silence, he said. Not the kind you had, but the kind that sneaks in when life doesn't look like what you planned. Grace looked at him, then really looked, and something inside her shifted. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but a crack in the armor. And sometimes that's where the light gets in. Morning came pale and silent, the storm finally retreating into the distant hills. Snow blanketed the town like a fresh beginning, but the windows of Chris's house still held the breath of the night, before fogged with the fear and firelight thick with the residue of something unspoken. Anna was resting comfortably in her room, bundled beneath every warm blanket Chris owned her fever, now just a memory. She stirred occasionally, murmuring dreams, her small hand occasionally reaching for someone who wasn't there. Chris found Grace outside clearing snow from the front steps with methodical strokes. She hadn't slept. Her movements were steady, precise, controlled, the kind of rhythm that only made sense to someone trying not to feel. You don't have to do that, he said gently. I know. He stood at the edge of the porch, coffee in hand, watching her. Come inside. Please. Grace hesitated. Then she leaned the shovel against the rail and followed him in her boots, leaving prints across the wooden floor. She stopped near the fireplace, held her hands out to the warmth, but never looked at him. Chris sat in the armchair beside the hearth. You didn't just command a unit, he said. You were the unit. She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it. He waited, let the silence build, not as pressure, but as invitation. Finally, her voice came flat, but careful. They called us Ghost Team 6, off the books, high-value target retrieval, SEALs trained for ops that didn't officially exist. Chris nodded slowly. We weren't heroes. We were knives. Tools used in places where diplomacy failed, places where the world still bleeds in silence. She sat on the edge of the hearth, facing the fire. My last mission was in Sudan. Intelligence said there were children hostages held by a splinter cell. We had 8 hours to breach extract and vanish. She paused, her jaw clenched. I miscalculated. The words hung there heavy as lead. There were more hostiles than predicted. Their firepower was stronger. We went in clean and came out in pieces. I lost 2 men, Darren Hart and Eli Rains. One to a landmine I didn't detect. The other stayed behind to cover our exit. He was 24. Her voice faltered just for a breath. I wrote letters to their families, letters full of honor and bravery and sacrifice. But the truth, I hesitated. For 3 seconds. I questioned the intel, and in those seconds, they died. Chris felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say something, but what words could matter in the face of that kind of guilt? I left the Navy 2 weeks later, Grace continued. Refused promotion. Refused reassignment. I packed up everything and disappeared. Didn't even cash my last check. She reached into her coat, pulling out a small notebook, leather-bound, worn at the edges. She handed it to him without a word. Chris opened it carefully. Inside were names, pages and pages of them, some with birth years, others with nothing but initials, some marked with check marks, some circled, some crossed out. I keep track, she said. Every civilian we extracted, every soldier we lost, every life we touched, saved, or ended. Chris turned to the last page. 2 names stood alone at the bottom. Anna. Chris, he looked up. You added us. She nodded. Because you brought me back. Chris shook his head, overwhelmed. Grace, we didn't do anything. You didn't treat me like a uniform she cut in. You let me be quiet. Broken. Invisible. And still every day you made room for me. That's more than medals or flags or speeches." Chris stared at the names again, at the careful handwriting of someone who had lived in chaos and chose order because it was the only thing that made sense. "You're not broken," he said. "I'm not whole either." He stood, walked to the fire, and gently took the book from her hands, placing it on the mantel. "Maybe none of us are. Maybe we're all just patchwork. But you're here. You stayed. And last night you saved my daughter." Grace looked up, eyes rimmed red. "I'm so tired, Chris," she whispered. "Tired of running, of pretending I'm not still in that field with their blood on my boots." Chris knelt in front of her, his hands resting lightly on hers. "Then stop running." She stared at him. "Stay. Not just in the garage, not just on the edge. Stay with us, with me." For a long moment, neither moved. Then slowly Grace leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. No kiss, no confession, just contact. It was the beginning of something neither of them knew how to name, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Grace let someone else help carry the weight. The first thaw came slowly seeping into the bones of the town like a secret. Patches of earth peeked through the snow, revealing brown grass and forgotten acorns. Icicles melted in long, reluctant drips. Spring was on its way, but in Grace's chest, the cold held firm. She stood at the edge of Chris's driveway, the duffel bag slung over her shoulder, again, her boots planted like she was preparing to retreat into a war zone. Chris leaned against the truck arms, folded, trying not to look like he was bracing for impact. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I do," Grace replied. "This part, at least." He nodded the words, bitter, but understood. She was going back, not to the battlefield, but to the place where everything about her had been made official. The Navy base, the administrative machine. She'd called the number from a burner phone 2 nights earlier, speaking to someone she once trusted with her life. "I need to finalize my separation," she told them. In person. It had been over a year since she'd walked off that base. They hadn't expected her back, but she had to close that door herself on her terms. Chris reached for her hand before she opened the passenger door. "Promise me something." She looked at him, eyes sharp, guarded. "Come back." Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile. "You planning to chain the garage door shut?" "No, I want you to want to come back." That softened her. She touched his chest just over his heart. "You and Anna gave me something I forgot how to want. Then don't forget again." The drive was long, the silence longer. They passed rolling hills gas stations with broken signs and motels that had seen better decades. Grace stared out the window most of the way, her jaw clenched, posture rigid. At one point, Chris glanced at her and said, "You know, if I were the kind of guy who gave pep talks, this would be the moment." She didn't look at him. "Don't." He chuckled softly. "Didn't think so." But the tension between them wasn't the sharp kind. It was thick with anticipation, like air before a storm. 2 hours outside the base, they stopped at a roadside diner. Grace sat across from him, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee she didn't drink. The fluorescent lights cast hard shadows on her face, emphasizing the scars no one could see. "You ever think about what comes next?" Chris asked. She raised an eyebrow. "After what?" "After you walk into that office. After the paperwork. After the salute they won't give you." Grace stared into her cup. "I don't know. I haven't allowed myself to plan for anything beyond the next sunrise in a long time." "Well," Chris said gently, "Anna thinks you should open a dojo in the backyard. Teach her how to stealth walk." Grace laughed under her breath. "She's got more natural awareness than half my old team." Chris smiled. "She also made a sign for your room. She used glitter glue. You've been warned. Grace rolled her eyes but didn't stop the corner of her mouth from lifting. Then the laughter faded. "What if I get there, and I remember why I left?" she asked. "What if I walk in, and all I see are ghosts?" Chris leaned forward. "Then you walk out again, but this time not alone." They arrived late in the afternoon. The Navy base loomed like a memory steel fences, cold concrete, and an aura of sterile detachment. Chris waited in the truck, while Grace walked through the gates, a temporary badge clipped to her collar, her duffel bag in hand. She was gone for hours. Chris watched clouds slide across the sky, thought about Anna, thought about how fragile people could be, even the strongest ones, especially the strongest ones. When Grace finally emerged, she walked differently, still upright, still composed, but something had shifted. Her shoulders weren't burdened. Her steps didn't carry the weight of 10,000 unspoken regrets. She climbed into the truck, dropped the badge onto the dashboard, and sighed. "It's done," she said. "That easy, no. But it's over." They drove in silence for a while before Chris asked, "You okay?" She looked at him. "No, but I'm better." The return trip was slower. They stopped once to watch deer cross a field once more for gas. The sky turned golden as they neared home, and Chris glanced over at her. "You know," he said casually, "the garage is still yours. Unless you'd rather have the guest room." Grace didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I was thinking about staying somewhere else." Chris's hands tightened on the wheel. Inside the house, she added, lips twitching. He exhaled. "Good. Besides," she said, her voice softer. "Now Anna already put up that glitter sign. I can't disappoint her." They arrived home just after dark. Anna flew out the front door, like a comet barreling into Grace with unchecked joy. "You came back." Grace crouched and wrapped her arms around the little girl, holding her tighter than she meant to. "I promised, didn't I?" Inside, Chris lit a fire, while Anna chattered about school and new drawings. Grace stood in the doorway watching them, her duffel bag still in hand. Chris approached and gently took the bag from her shoulder. "You're not a guest," he said. She looked up at him, eyes bright but unreadable. "Then what am I?" He leaned in, brushed her cheek with his thumb. "You're home." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. It had been 12 days since Grace moved into the guest room, and the rhythm of the house began to subtly, quietly shift around her presence. Morning routines absorbed her without resistance. Anna now sat 3 places at the breakfast table without being asked. Chris brewed a second cup of coffee without thinking. And every evening Grace stood at the sink after dinner, her sleeves rolled up, washing dishes in silence, while Anna hummed nearby. She didn't talk about the base. She didn't need to. Whatever ghosts she'd faced there had not followed her back. Or if they had, they were quieter now. Chris noticed things, the way she no longer flinched at sudden sounds, how she let her hand linger on Anna's shoulder, longer how she sometimes fell asleep on the couch without setting a mental perimeter. These were small things. But for Grace, they were seismic. One crisp Sunday morning, Chris found a note taped to the fridge in Grace's steady, no-nonsense handwriting. "Gone for a walk. Back before lunch." It was the first time she'd left a message. It felt domestic, intentional, like she was tethering herself to this place, one thread at a time. But then noon came, and then 1. And by 2, Chris stood in the garage looking at the neatly folded blanket on the cot, the duffel bag gone. He found the letter on his nightstand, a single sheet of paper. No envelope, no salutation. "Chris, I told myself I wouldn't run again. But maybe I was lying just a little to both of us. There's a part of me that still doesn't know how to live in peace, a part that believes I'm only safe when I'm not standing still. You've been good for me, too good maybe. You and Anna pulled me out of something I wasn't sure I could leave behind, but I still carry it, even after the base, even after the papers were signed and the badge returned, there's something inside me that won't sleep, something that still hears gunfire and wind and sees danger in doorways. I needed space to see if I could live without that part leading me. Please don't look for me. Please don't think this was about you. It wasn't. You gave me a place to rest. Now I have to figure out if I can build something of my own. Take care of her and of yourself. Grace. Chris read it twice. 3 times. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, the paper limp in his hands. He didn't feel anger, not even confusion. Just that familiar ache of something good slipping through his fingers again. Anna found him there an hour later. She climbed into his lap without a word, sensing more than she understood. Her small fingers clutched his shirt. She's not coming back, is she? Chris swallowed. I don't know, sweetheart. Anna thought for a moment. Then did you tell her she could? He hesitated, not in those exact words. Anna nodded solemnly. Then maybe she doesn't know. 3 nights passed. The quiet in the house was different now. Not the peaceful stillness Grace had brought, but the hollow kind. The kind that echoed. Chris tried to distract himself. He fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen, organized the garage, cooked meals that no one touched much, and at night, he sat by the fire long after Anna had gone to sleep, hoping for headlights that didn't appear. Then on the 4th day, a package arrived at the front door. No return address. Chris opened it slowly. Inside was Grace's leather notebook, the one she kept tucked inside her coat, the one filled with names. At the bottom of the last page, beneath the names of his daughter and himself, was a new line written in ink that hadn't yet dried. This isn't the end. It's the breath between. Below it, a small folded map, a location circled 3 counties away, and next to it, in her unmistakable hand, if you believe this is still my home, come find me. Chris didn't wait. He packed an overnight bag, kissed Anna's forehead while she slept, and left a note for the neighbor to check in the next morning. The road stretched long and dark ahead, but he didn't feel uncertainty. He felt momentum, because some people run to escape, and some run to see who will follow. The road wound through pine-covered hills, the kind of landscape that felt untouched by time, quiet, secretive, and ancient in its stillness. Chris drove without music, windows down, just enough to let the cold air bite his skin, keeping him alert. The map Grace had sent wasn't to a house, not exactly. It led to an old ranger station, decommissioned, overgrown, halfway between civilization and nowhere. He recognized her, thinking it was a place with solitude and structure, removed enough to feel safe, close enough to remain tethered. It was also the kind of place you didn't send someone to unless you wanted them to find you. When he pulled up, the driveway was little more than a dirt path choked with leaves. A rusted gate hung lopsided from one hinge. Chris parked, climbed out, and scanned the clearing. She was sitting on the front porch, boots on the railing arms, crossed eyes, shaded beneath the brim of a ball cap. I was wondering how long it would take, Grace said. Chris didn't smile. He didn't speak. He walked up the steps and sat beside her without asking. They sat like that for a minute, maybe 2. The silence didn't feel angry. It felt paused. I didn't leave because I was afraid of you, Grace said eventually. I know. I left because I wasn't sure who I was when I wasn't surviving something. Chris nodded slowly. Did you figure it out? She stared out into the trees. Not entirely. But I realized something out here. What's that? She turned to him, eyes searching his. That the things that make us strong can also keep us alone if we let them. I've been a shield for so long, I forgot what it's like to be held. Chris inhaled, his voice quiet. You're allowed to be held. She looked down at her hands. I don't know if I'll ever be good at this. This isn't a test, he said. It's life. and no one's good at it all the time. She exhaled one long, slow breath and leaned back in her chair. Inside the station, there was a makeshift kitchen, a camp stove, a kettle. Chris boiled water while Grace unpacked a tin of mismatched mugs. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Later, she showed him the room she'd converted into a writing space. There were no weapons, no military memorabilia, just a desk, a pile of books, and a corkboard, with a few notes pinned up. Quotes, scraps of thought. One caught his eye. Peace isn't the absence of battle. It's the presence of something worth returning to. He turned to her. "This yours?" She nodded. "Found it in an old journal I kept during my first tour. I never believed it then. But now," she hesitated. "Now, I want it to be true." Chris reached out and took her hand. "Then, make it true." They returned home the next day. Grace didn't ask for her old room. She didn't mention the garage. She simply walked through the front door like she had every right to be there, and this time she believed it. Anna ran into her arms like she'd never left. The glitter sign was still taped to the guest room door, crooked and slightly faded. Grace left it there. The days passed gently. Chris caught glimpses of her transformation in small ways, the way she started humming when making coffee, how she let Anna braid her hair on Saturdays, the book of poetry she kept on the nightstand. She even started keeping her boots by the front door, not laced, not lined up like a soldier, but relaxed, settled. And one day, while Chris was fixing a fence post, he looked up and saw Grace laughing, head thrown back unguarded, while Anna chased her with a garden hose. It hit him. Then she wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. That evening, Chris cooked dinner, while Anna drew a picture of their family. Grace stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching them with a look that belonged more to a woman than to a warrior. "You thinking of adding us to your notebook?" Chris asked, setting a pot on the stove. Grace shook her head. "I retired it." Chris raised an eyebrow. "It's on the shelf," she added. "Behind the cookbooks." He walked over, pulled it down, and flipped to the last page. The names were still there. Anna. Chris. But now beneath them in a new column, one word. Us. Chris closed the book, gently returning it to its place. That night, after Anna had gone to bed, and the fire had burned down to embers, Grace turned to Chris, her voice quiet in the hush of the living room. "I think I'm ready." For what he asked, to stop counting the lives I couldn't save. He reached for her hand. "Then maybe it's time to start counting the ones you still can." She leaned into him, then her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since they met, she exhaled not in defense, but in peace. Because in the end, it wasn't war or medals or ghosts that defined her. It was the quiet, unremarkable decision to stay. And in staying, she saved herself. The morning of the ceremony dawned golden, and still sunlight filtering through the old oak tree in Chris's front yard, casting soft, swaying shadows over the porch. The air carried the crispness of early spring, the kind that hinted at both endings and beginnings. Anna was up early, her excitement contagious, as she raced through the house in a flurry of braids and ribbons, a handmade paper star pinned to her dress. "Don't be late," she shouted toward the back room, where Grace stood in front of a mirror, with a comb frozen in her hand. Chris leaned in the doorway behind her. "Want help with that?" Grace glanced at him through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "I haven't worn my hair like this since my first deployment." He walked over and gently took the comb from her. "Then maybe today's a good day to start again." She let him work in silence. There was something deeply intimate about the act. No fanfare, no agenda. Just hands untangling the past, one strand at a time. "You nervous?" he asked. Grace gave a soft laugh. "I've jumped out of helicopters into gunfire with less adrenaline than this." "Well," he said, brushing her hair back. I doubt anyone's going to shoot. But they might clap. Loudly. She smiled despite herself. Terrifying. The school auditorium buzzed with community chatter. Fold-out chairs lined the room, and the scent of glue sticks and construction paper hung faintly in the air. The backdrop on stage was hand-painted by students, a field of stars, a crude American flag, and stick figures labeled heroes. Chris and Grace took their seats in the second row as Anna's class filed onto the stage, their voices rising in a hesitant rendition of America the Beautiful. Grace sat straighter than everyone else, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward, not out of formality but focus. She was learning to let these moments in. When it came time for the student essays, Anna stepped up to the microphone. My hero, she began, is someone who doesn't wear a cape or drive a fire truck. She doesn't tell people what she's done because she doesn't need to. But I know, because she saved me. A hush fell over the room. She lives at our house, Anna continued, voice clear. She knows how to fix things and cook better grilled cheese than Daddy, and she lets me braid her hair, even though she says it's ridiculous. But the best thing she does is she stays, even when it's hard. Chris turned slightly to glance at Grace. She didn't move. Her jaw was tight, her eyes glassy. My hero's name is Grace Anna, said beaming. And she's the bravest person I know. The room erupted into applause. Grace remained seated, her hands clenched in her lap until Anna ran down and flung herself into her arms. You weren't supposed to cry, the little girl whispered. I didn't, Grace whispered back, voice cracking. Not really. Later, as people mingled over cookies and lemonade, the school principal approached Grace. I heard you served, she said, extending a hand. Grace hesitated, then shook it. A while ago. Well, thank you. If you're ever interested in speaking to our older students about leadership resilience, anything, you'd be welcome any time. Grace nodded. I'll think about it. She meant it. That evening, they sat on the porch again. Anna was inside, curled up on the couch with a book. The world outside smelled like damp earth and fresh beginnings. Chris handed Grace a folded sheet of paper. What's this? She asked. Anna's speech. I asked for a copy. Grace opened it slowly, reading the scrawled handwriting. She paused halfway through, her eyes lingering on the line. She stays, even when it's hard. She looked up at Chris. You ever think about how much of life is just that, showing up, staying put, all the time? Grace set the paper down. You know what scares me most. Chris turned toward her. That one day I might stop looking over my shoulder and not recognize myself. He reached for her hand, warm and steady. Then we'll remind you. Every single day. She held his gaze, and something in her face shifted, not just gratitude, not just affection, but recognition. Of him, of herself, of the life they were slowly, stubbornly building. Chris stood and disappeared inside, returning with something behind his back. Grace raised an eyebrow. If that's another glitter sign, I'm moving out. He grinned and revealed a small wooden plaque, hand-carved, sanded, smooth, with just 2 words burned into the surface. Welcome home. Grace took it with both hands, fingers tracing the grain. No medals, no ranks, just truth. And when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but this time, she didn't turn away. She didn't flinch. She stayed. And in staying, she found something more powerful than any mission she'd ever commanded. A reason to begin again. If this story touched you the way it touched us, while telling it, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel and how many hearts they quietly reach. And if you'd like to join us for more stories about love, resilience, and the quiet power of kindness, feel free to subscribe. We share these moments, not just to tell them, but to remind each other that even in a noisy world, goodness still echoes. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep believing in the small miracles.